For 20 years, she woke before dawn when the house was still wrapped in the cold hush of the valley, and the stars had not yet given way to the first pale breath of morning. Rosa Hernández rose with the steady rhythm of work in her bones, hands first to the metal pot, then to the stub of dry wood stacked by the fogón, fingers that had known the weight of ladles and brooms, and the slow, exacting business of keeping other people's lives clean. She set the clay mug to warm on the lip of the stove, watching the thin black steam sigh up like a small private prayer. The mug was chipped at the rim, stained by the mole and the coffee she had learned to make without measuring. It fit her hand as if it had been made for her, the gloss worn smooth by years of fingers. Outside, the hacienda breathed, a long, low creak of shutters, the distant bay of a hound, the oil lamp still guttering in the servants' quarters. Inside, porcelain cups for the family waited on the table like a ceremony. The Mendoza household moved at a different hour, late, important, their cups delicate. Rosa would not complain. There were small satisfactions carved into routine, the first sip of heat against a morning chilled through the bones, the way the tortilla browned perfectly when cupped on the comal, the soft, earnest thanks Don Rafael offered once in a while, the only thing he ever said that sounded like a father's voice. Her life had been built of these small things. She had been 12 when the revolution took her mother and the farm where they had lived on the other side of the hills. Bandits had come running like a rumor, and the years after were full of running and hard faces and nights with no roof, until Don Rafael Mendoza found her shivering at the road and set her a plate. He sent a carriage for her, told the driver to take her to Hacienda San Miguel, and said nothing more. The house kept her. The kitchen kept her. For 2 decades, she scrubbed floors, mended shirts, bore the heat of summers, the damp of winters, and the patient, private grief that never softened into complaint. There were whispers sometimes in the kitchens of other houses, the kind of small talk that passes for gossip in villages where everyone is someone's neighbor. Some said Don Rafael had a soft heart. Some said he had always wanted an heir, and that Rosa, abandoned and small, had filled that need in his life. Rosa herself did not indulge such talk. She carried a photograph instead, tucked into the hem of her apron, a small oval likeness of a woman with a tired smile, who smelled of lavender in print. Rosa kept it for reasons she could barely name, a private relic that sometimes made her think of a life before chores and before polite distance. When Don Rafael's cough finally took on the cadence of something that would not be cured by the doctor's poultices, the household's routine shifted, like a building settling. Men with clean hands and black coats arrived. Ropes of linen were folded with a gravity that turned the house inward. Rosa watched him from the doorway that day, the old man sitting small and thin under a blanket, eyes like dull coals, calling her near as if to list things he wanted to leave where they might do some good. "You have been faithful," he told her once, his voice a gravelly whisper made softer by time. "You have kept this house cleaner than anyone thinks to notice. Sit close." His hand, large and veined, found her shoulder and pressed as if to fix her to a moment. He did not say more than that. He never said he was her father aloud. But there were folded papers in his desk and a small sealed envelope he placed in the hands of the one appointed to be his notary, Licenciado Fuentes, with instructions to wait until the reading of the will, to mention a modest bequest and the sealed envelope stored in the safe. The official man nodded, a solemn little movement that would be called duty more than affection. The funeral drew townsfolk in a slow procession, as if gravity itself were laying claim to what was left. The bells were muffled. The house seemed larger for the absence of the old man's presence. Valentina Mendoza Aguirre arrived in a hat that made her shoulders look more angular, her gloves white and pristine, a niece who had been living in Guadalajara with a steady husband and a taste for counting things aloud. When she stepped into the hall, she looked like someone accustomed to being assumed right. Her eyes slid over the servants as if they were fixtures, important in their place but easily dismissed. The reading of the will was a small theater. Everyone gathered in the sala under chandeliers that collected dust in filigreed patterns. Licenciado Fuentes, a man with a measured face, cleared his throat and read the paper's formal language aloud. The estate was divided as custom and law demanded, a dowry here, a trust there, small ornaments to long-serving servants. Rosa's name came with a modest sum and a pouch of coins that, if she were to buy anything with them, would not lift her out of years of service. The room fitted that modesty with the same small, kindly dismissal Don Rafael had once used, a gesture, a nod, a separate, simpler plate at the end of the table. But also, Licenciado Fuentes said, lifting a sleeve and producing a sealed envelope from the velvet-lined safe in which he'd placed it upon the dead man's instructions, a private testament, to be opened according to Don Rafael's direction. The envelope itself was unremarkable, thick paper, a red seal impressed with a crest, edges browned by smoke and time. Valentina's lips moved as she watched, as if she were trying to taste its content before the law allowed it. She inclined her head toward the servile corner where Rosa stood, as if to measure the right amount of scorn. Rosa felt a small, inexplicable warmth in the palm where Don Rafael had once rested his fingers. That warmth was not hope, it was memory. She listened to the clauses read, the legal language wrapping custody of land and titles in cadence and paper. The sealed envelope was to be opened in the notary's office if certain conditions, trifles of legal form, were satisfied. For now, it remained a dark promise. The word co-heiress lingered like a detained bird in the air, possible and not yet free. Valentina smiled then, a small, practiced curve that carried the weight of her certainty. "My uncle would have wanted his estate kept in honorable hands," she said softly, meaning herself. "We will make sure San Miguel continues the family name." Rosa, who had learned to be quiet, felt the floor under her feet as though it had shifted. The modest bequest felt like an acknowledgement and an exile at once. Gratitude wrapped in the clear, thin paper of a servant's place. When night fell, the household divided into the practical arrangements of ropes and ledgers, and Rosa fitted the last plates back into their cabinets. She held the little photograph at the end of her work, prayed, if prayer could be named for it, a prayer that had no words, only the ache that rises in the chest when one thinks of what might have been. It did not take long before envy, the most ordinary seed, sprouted into action. Valentina moved like one who makes her life from decisions, swift and economical. Maybe she was jealous because she never had to wash a pan. Maybe she was afraid the rumor that Don Rafael had favored Rosa might crystallize and compromise the tidy inheritance she expected. She began small, suggestions to the commissario about petty thefts in the house, discreet remarks tossed into the courtyard, the placement of doubt like a grain of salt into soup. There were also the gold coins that appeared in the drain near the kitchen where Rosa worked, bright rounds of money that had no obvious owner. Lupita, a younger maid and friend to Rosa, found them and, alarmed, pocketed them, thinking they might buy bread or medicine. Valentina saw the action through a lattice and turned her face into a mask. The next morning, the sound of heavy boots made Rosa look up from her work. The commissario, Ramon Cordero, arrived with the kind of official gravity that announces consequences. He carried no bells, his business was not pageantry, but law, and the way a village keeps itself with rules. Behind him, as if to bolster her accusation with presence, came Esteban, the capataz. Esteban had known Rosa since before he was a foreman. His hands, like hers, had been conditioned by labor. He looked torn when he stepped into the kitchen, eyes flicking from Valentina's composed face to Rosa's apron-streaked hands. "You have to tell the truth," Valentina said, in a tone that was polite like a blade. "We found coins where the servants keep their pans. We must be sure no one has been taking from the house." Rosa opened her mouth, closed it. The accusation was a thing that falls upon you like rain. You either stand there and get wet or seek shelter that may not be waiting. Lupita, pale and trembling, tried to speak up. "They were in the drain, Senor. But Valentina's hand motioned for silence. She moved with the confidence of someone who believes her version will be taken for fact. Esteban's voice was small, which cut across him like a bitter wind. "I saw the coins at the drain. Lupita picked them up." He looked at Rosa as if asking for an explanation from the air itself. Rosa felt the old man's presence in his eyes, a memory of him working by her side, and she reached for the only thing that could stand in a crowd meant to diminish her, the truth. "I did not touch any of the house's money," Rosa said, her voice steady now because steadiness had been trained into her like a reflex. "I would not steal from the Mendoza house. Don Rafael would have—" She stopped because invoking the dead is a risk when tempers flare. "If those coins are missing from where they should be, let us look. There are ledgers, there are keys." Valentina smiled thinly. "We can keep this out of a worse scandal," she told the commissario, "but such things cannot go uninvestigated for the good of the house." Her words were wrapped in the language of propriety. The commissario nodded. He took instructions from the higher house as if they were law. The servants watched with a sick silence. Rumors moved like a second shadow through the courtyard. Some called it justice in the making. Others saw a trap laid with an elegance that felt cruel. They made Rosa stand in the entry while they searched. They opened the pantry, they pried into drawers, they turned over the linen chests. The search was thorough enough to be humiliating and perfunctory enough to be theater. Eventually, they lifted Lupita's hand and saw the coins tucked into the hem of her skirt. Valentina's eyes gleamed like a victor's. She pronounced the discovery a confirmation. The commissario, noting the coins and Lupita's explanation, declared there must be consequences. Rosa did not fight. There was not much one could do when the machinery of accusation had been wound. She had been a servant for 2 decades. Indignation does not wash away the stain of a public accusation. They put a cloth over her shoulders like a ragged mantle and took her to the plaza at night as if she were to be displayed for neighbors to spit at. In the light of the oil lamps, townspeople came to stare, some quietly, some loudly to cluck with moral pleasure. Children were hushed, dogs sniffed at the margins, and Rosa stood small, the clay mug she had set on the fogon still warm in a memory. Padre Miguel found her later in the doorway of the church, where she had drifted away from the crowd. The priest did not brandish theology. He offered a blanket and bread, a steadiness that was not judgment. "Come," he said, as one might invite a traveler to a fire. "Rest here tonight." His church smelled of wax and incense, thin and not as heavy as the house's accusations. He had been a friend to Don Rafael and had seen how the old man's life tangled with Rosa's. He took her in with that simple mercy clerics sometimes have when the world seems to have grown small and cruel. "Why would they do this?" Lupita whispered when she was able to find Rosa by the church hearth, guilt making her voice sharp. She had been a faithful friend and now sat with her head in her hands because she had thought to hide the coins for a moment safekeeping and had not understood the ripples that would follow. Rosa took her hand and held it without a word. The church's candles made their faces softened, magnified by the large icons that looked down without surprise. Rosa's shame was private and sharp, but shame can be an engine of calm, too. People who have borne it long learn how to carry it without being undone. There were those who believed in her innocence, an old washerwoman who'd seen Rosa since the child's arrival, an apprentice cook who whispered that Rosa had been nothing but honest. But in that night of shame, community did not protect her. It observed her. The commissario's finality had a seriousness to it that did not leave room for gentle doubts. He delivered a sentence that felt less like law than social exile. Rosa was to leave the hacienda at once. With the night breathing cold against her face and a blanket at her shoulders, she was guided to the road with her few belongings, the clay mug among them. She left as silently as she had arrived years before, her small suitcase a collection of what her life had been, a spool of thread, a faded dress, the photograph in a leather casing. Memory had no legal standing, and yet it was all she had to remind herself that dignity could persist even when the world pronounced otherwise. In the days that followed, as Rosa wandered toward the town and the priest's modest house, those who had orchestrated her fall continued with the formalities of an inheritance settling into hands. Valentina, who had always favored clarity of paper over the messy ethics of affection, moved quickly to consolidate influence. She arranged inventories, consulted lawyers in town, and sent for men with wagons to tally harvests. There was a swift aligning of ledgers that looked like the setting of a trap. The household's greater goods were being made ready for distribution. But in the notary's office, things unfold on a different plane. Licenciado Fuentes was a man used to folded paper and the smell of ink. His hands knew the tremor of sealing wax, the stern satisfaction of a signature. He had been entrusted, respectfully and with a hint of gravity that recognizes the weight of time, with the sealed envelope Don Rafael had insisted be kept safe until called for. In the days after the funeral, Fuentes sat alone at his desk in the cool of the private office, the safe, heavy and iron, the envelope beside him like a sleeping thing. He had taken an oath to the law and to the wishes laid down by a man whose health had been failing, and the law bound him to process all claims with exactness. Valentina came to the notary with her husband and other influential allies, an entourage of certainty. She demanded quick resolutions, a closing of accounts, a finality that would end the murmur of a scandal she feared might weaken her claim. "We cannot have this place sullied by rumors," she told Fuentes. Her voice was soft, but the message was sharp. "We need to know where we stand." Fuentes listened, his face an exercise in impartiality. "All declarations will be carried out as instructed," he replied. "There is a sealed testament. It will be opened at the proper time in proper form." Outside, the hacienda's business continued, but the air carried a tension that tasted like iron. Esteban, who had stood with the imprint of labor on his palms, paced between loyalties. He had been loyal to the house, to Don Rafael's commands, and to the men who worked under him. Yet, when the coins had been shown and he had raised his voice, an act he would regret, there had been a small cleft opened in him. He did not want to have been the man to push a beloved woman into the night. He had watched Rosa leave and saw the way her shoulders did not carry rage, but a quiet, steady resignation that stabbed him with something like shame. On the third night after her exile, Rosa found shelter under Padre Miguel's care in a small room behind the church that smelled of linen and writing ink. The priest gave her bread and a place to sleep and said nothing about restitution. "We will not let this stand alone," he told her, in a voice that was less cleric than human. Those words were not a promise of a miracle. They were a small, honest reassurance that a man could offer another when he meant the weight of it. Rosa's days in that church-room were not spent in plotting revenge. She tasted the bitter bread and brewed tea made from herbs collected from the rectory garden, and she thought through things as a woman must who has lived under the architecture of service for so long. What was her claim? What evidence had Don Rafael left? The envelope in the notary's safe, the sealed testament, the mention of a bequest. How much of that was legal weight, and how much was an unfulfilled obligation? She knew little of law beyond the way a signature looked, the curve of a name written in respect. But she had learned the sturdiness of facts. Paper could witness when words could be denied. The envelope in the safe was the sort of thing that would not be swept away by a clean lie. Word of her exile reached some in the town who cared. An older widow who had been Don Rafael's midwife came to the little room with a stew and stories. "He used to come to my kitchen and ask after you," she said, stirring the pot with a spoon that had belonged to her mother. She spoke in the slow cadence of someone who tended to truth like one tends to a fire. He did right in his head. He kept a man's conscience with him. Such fragments were a small comfort, but they could not, on their own, disrobe the certainty that Valentina had dressed herself in. Meanwhile, at the notary's office, documents became weather, some to be filed, others to be read aloud in ceremonies that would decide futures. Licenciado Fuentes moved the sealed envelope across the room as if feeling for the balance of it. He could have placed it back in the safe and held it there for months or years, letting the seasons move the lives of those it concerned. But responsibilities pressed. Clients came with ledgers and lists and insistence. He made a note to look into Don Rafael's handwritten directions, to examine whether circumstances had been satisfied that would permit the sealed testament to be opened. The safe's iron was cool under his fingers. The key lay in a bowl of brass, dull and waiting. Valentina, sensing the slowness of legal pace as an affront to her claimed right, grew impatient. Her patience narrowed like a lens and then snapped. Within the next days, she took steps that were both petty and effective. She circulated a rumor about missing small valuables. She made sure the commissario received a version of events that painted Rosa as a latecomer to theft. It is simple to lay a trap when you have the advantage of caste and coin. She placed incriminating objects in places where guilt would be obvious and easy to read, and she had men ready to find them. When the coins were found, elegantly planted by a hand that understood the stage they would perform on, Valentina ensured witnesses would confirm the discovery. The action was cunning in its ordinariness. The village is a place where stories move fast, and the more ordinary the lie, the quicker it is believed. No one thought to question why someone with 2 decades of service would suddenly commit a petty theft, why a woman who had eaten the Mendoza bread would risk her livelihood for a handful of coins. People are inclined to believe what fits neatly into the small narratives they already hold. That night, the town watch posted notice of Rosa's departure. The wind carried her few possessions away down the dusty road as if the place were sweeping out its faults. Her heart, which had carried grief and work for so long, ached with a new knowledge. Dignity must sometimes be taken back with force, and she had none at that moment. The morning after she left, a day when the sun rose pink and awkward, as if apologizing for coming up at all, Licenciado Fuentes received a visitor who arrived before the market was fully awake. A messenger from a neighboring town with papers imperative and a list of obligations. He brought sentences that required Fuentes' attention and a subtle reminder that the law moves to the speed of commerce. The envelope remained on the desk, watched and neglected as a sleeping animal. Fuentes wrapped his fingers around the key and felt the cold iron as a thing with no emotion. He had been a notary for years. He knew that certain documents must be opened in their time, and he also knew the contagious danger of haste. Across the valley, Valentina presided over the household accounts with triumph that tasted bitter. She placed orders for repairs and had men tally the fields. She gave the workers more strict instructions about hours and rations, as if tightening the screws would make the house steadier. But houses are made of people, and people resist being wound with the wrong hand. Murmurs of unease began in the kitchens and among the fields. Esteban murmured apologies in corners. Lupita's face took on a look that mixed shame and sorrow. The washerwoman shook her head when she thought no one saw. Rosa, in the church room with Padre Miguel, put the photograph on the blanket beside her and smoothed the edges. The woman in the oval looked back with a kind of dignified sadness that Rosa had grown to recognize as kinship. She slept poorly, but she slept. The priest brought her a bowl of stew and some news. Licenciado Fuentes had penned a note asking respectfully whether any interested party would contest the opening of the sealed envelope. It was a small thing, merely a question of process, but it registered in Rosa like the beginnings of something else. The law itself was aware, and paper remained. The sealed testament, Padre Miguel said, in the quiet voice of one who tends to both human souls and the unrepeatable business of church records. It waits on the notary's shelf. He will do what is right. Rosa nodded. Rightness was a difficult thing to measure, and the law carried its own prejudices. But a sealed paper is stubborn even against those who would burn a portrait to answer a grudge. She held on to that stubbornness like a bead of light. News made the rounds. Valentina called witnesses and quieted speakers with coin or with the gravity of her connections. She turned her social circuits into a net. But documents, those quiet witnesses of another kind, sometimes tell different truths. Fuentes prepared letters and petitions, a modest flurry of legal steps that would, if justice permitted, begin to open the box of what had been arranged by Don Rafael. The notary was careful, slow, aware that opening a sealed testament can be like striking a match in a darkened house. The light will reveal everything in its small circle, and secrets will have to face the air. On an evening that smelled of rain and the fields after a long dry stretch, Fuentes took up the key. He had written notes to himself, crossed names in margins, consulted a ledger. Someone knocked at his door. The sound was polite and deliberate. He opened to find a neighbor with a small parcel and the news that Valentina had been in town, pressing for swift settlement. Fuentes closed his door and sat. He felt the weight of law like he felt the weight of lead in his vest, heavy, anchored, not to be tossed lightly. He walked to the iron safe and placed his hand on the cold metal. The room was quiet except for the soft patter of rain on the tiles. He set the sealed envelope upon the desk beside the ledger and stared at it for a long minute, as if the paper would speak. He glanced at his watch, an old brass thing, and noted the hour. There was a formality in unlocking a safe, the same formalities that had guided him through births and marriages and deaths. He took the key and turned it. The tumblers inside the iron beast moved one by one with a mechanical sigh. Outside, the valley lay sleeping and unaware. Inside, the notary's office held its breath. Rosa, at the church, prayed without words and stirred the pot of tea as if to stir up courage. Esteban walked the fields, hands buried in pockets, thinking perhaps of steps not taken. Valentina slept and dreamed of final ledgers. Lupita cried herself to sleep that night, the coins heavy in memory. Licenciado Fuentes lifted the lid of the safe. The envelope sat there, the red wax unmelted, edges browned from a life of being handled gently. He brought it to the desk, placed it on a blotter, and smoothed the paper with a fingernail as one smooths the face of someone sleeping. The room tightened with possibility and fear. His thumb rested upon the seal, feeling its warmth like a heartbeat. He reached for the letter opener, slow and deliberate, and at the same time the valley seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for the truth to climb out of paper and announce itself into the light. If paper could be a living thing, that sealed envelope had breath enough to change a life. The notary drew the blade across the seam and raised the flap. In the downpour outside, the world leaned forward. Inside the safe, words waited. Paper that had the power to set a mansion to rights, to correct a wrong, to name a woman as something more than a servant. The blade sliced the wax. There was a moment then when a sound was made that was smaller than thunder and louder than any human shout. The snapping open of a seal, the soft rustle of paper that had been waiting to be read. And when Licenciado Fuentes unfolded the first sheet and saw the handwriting that had once guided Don Rafael's hand, he felt the weight of what the ink might mean. He read, aloud to himself first, then with a voice that summoned the room's air to attention, the first formal lines that would not be read in a sala, but would be recorded in a ledger's margin. Names, a birth, a legal declaration that carried the weight of a father's final intention. Outside the notary's window, a carriage rattled past under the rain. Inside, the paper trembled with words that could lift a woman back to her place. The blade sliced the wax. There was a moment then when a sound was made that was smaller than thunder and louder than any human shout. The snapping open of a seal, the soft rustle of paper that had been waiting to be read. And when Licenciado Fuentes unfolded the first sheet and saw the handwriting that had once guided Don Rafael's hand, he felt the weight of what the ink might mean. He read, aloud to himself first, then with a voice that summoned the room's air to attention, the first formal lines that would not be read in a sala, but would be recorded in a ledger's margin. Names, a birth, a legal declaration that carried the weight of a father's final intention. Outside the notary's window, a carriage rattled past under the rain. Inside, the paper trembled with words that could lift a woman back to her place. And Rosa, in the church a stone's throw away, did not yet know what was unfurling on the other side of town. She sat with her photograph and the wavering light of a candle and thought of the house she had swept 20 years for, the rooms she had polished until they gleamed like the future, as imagined in other people's eyes. The notary breathed the letters as if they were a relic. He cleared his throat and reached for another sheet, the kind of movement a man makes when he cannot yet guess the consequences of what he reads. He had read many documents in his life, but this one had a different gravity. It contained the kind of truth that reorganizes households, the kind of name that can unpick a net woven of whispers and replace it with something sturdier, legal fact. The rain slowed to a fine mist. The light in the notary's lamp threw a small yellow halo over the paper. Fuentes' lips moved as he read the last clause. On the final line, the hand that had written it placed a name, clear and exact. Rosa's name. For those who work with paper, a name is a thing that has teeth, the power to grip and change direction. Licenciado Fuentes set the letter down as if the paper itself might answer. He folded the sheet with care and reached for his ink to make the record, fully aware that a reading would have to be scheduled, witnesses called, the proper legal forms observed. He knew, as every man of his profession knew, that a paper read without procedure is like a seed dropped in cracked soil. It may sprout, but it may also be denied life. He made his decisions with the gravity of a man who must take care. He would call for the reading, for witnesses, for the formality of the law to be observed. The sealed testament had been opened, and its content, whatever it was, would not be brushed aside because a jealous woman had planted coins. The law had teeth, too. It moved more slowly than vindication, but it had a sturdier hand. A knock came at the door, a messenger perhaps, or a servant with a note. The notary excused himself and stepped to retrieve the paper. He glanced at the envelope where the wax lay broken like a small wound. Outside, somewhere along the road, a woman who had swept a house for 20 years slept fitfully, not yet knowing that the world was about to rearrange itself on the strength of ink and seal. Inside the shop, Licenciado Fuentes wrote a careful note, summoning witnesses and making arrangements for a reading to be held with due ceremony. He did not yet go to the hacienda. He would not make the announcement in the street. There were steps to be observed, witnesses to swear, a ledger to enter the reality of a man's death and the wishes he'd left. But the first, most intimate thing had been done. The envelope had been opened, and the papers within had named Rosa. Rain tapered off to a whisker. The lamp in the notary's office hummed. Outside, someone coughed in the courtyard of the hacienda. Esteban stood alone by the fence, chewing at a tight corner of his lip. Lupita's hands shook with the memory of how, in a moment of fear, She had put coins in her skirt and watched the world she loved narrow to a point. Valentina slept in a bed that may hold bad dreams of being undone. And Rosa, with the photograph cradled like a small treasure, sat in the church and listened to the slow drip of water from the eaves. The law had begun to move. The sealed envelope no longer held its secret. The notary's careful hand would be the instrument by which what was in the paper would become known. That knowledge might restore her place. It might also complicate the lives of those who had thought themselves secure. It would demand courage and a willingness to face a public reparation. Rosa's path was not a road back to ease, but one that would require dignity, strategy, and the courage to insist on being seen. When the notary finally rose from his desk, holding a small pile of papers wrapped with string, the night had yielded to a soft gray. He tucked the first sheet into his jacket and walked toward the door with the quiet pace of a man about to set legal machinery in motion. He had done his duty in opening the envelope. Now he would arrange the forms so that what needed to be admitted to fact would be entered on record. The law does not speed through emotion. It proceeds through procedure, and therein lies its power to overturn slander and lay the truth in the clear light of public record. Rosa, unaware, folded the photograph beneath her pillow and blew out the candle. Her hands trembled a little as she lay down, the ache of humiliation still near, but the smallest ember of something like hope beginning to warm. The night kept its own counsel, but dawn would come, and with it the motion of people who keep the world's accounts true or false. The sealed testament had been opened. The papers were in the notary's hands. The first move towards something like justice had been made. Outside the church, the wind shifted and carried the smell of wet earth and the faint smoke from the hacienda's chimneys. Inside, Rosa turned over on the thin mattress and for the first time in many nights imagined a room that might be hers, not out of habit or hired work, but by the right of a name written in ink by a hand she had never known. The thought was both terrifying and tender. She did not yet have the mansion's keys. She had not demanded an apology. But the world had rearranged itself by an inch, and in that inch there is always a start. The notary's summons went out with the strict small print formality of the law. Witnesses required at the hour named, proceedings to be carried out in the notary's public room, any objections to be made then and there. Rosa, unaware, folded the photograph beneath her pillow and blew out the candle. Her hands trembled a little as she lay down, the ache of humiliation still near, but the smallest ember of something like hope beginning to warm. The night kept its own counsel, but dawn would come, and with it the motion of people who keep the world's accounts true or false. The sealed testament had been opened. The papers were in the notary's hands. The first move towards something like justice had been made. Outside the church, the wind shifted and carried the smell of wet earth and the faint smoke from the hacienda's chimneys. Inside, Rosa turned over on the thin mattress and for the first time in many nights imagined a room that might be hers, not out of habit or hired work, but by the right of a name written in ink by a hand she had never known. The thought was both terrifying and tender. She did not yet have the mansion's keys. She had not demanded an apology, but the world had rearranged itself by an inch, and in that inch there is always a start. The notary's summons went out with the strict small print formality of the law. Witnesses required at the hour named, proceedings to be carried out in the notary's public room, any objections to be made then and there. Word traveled through the town with the sort of hush that comes when people sense ledger and priestly ritual are about to touch their lives. It was not rumor exactly, but paper motion, that particular kind of movement that promises change. Padre Miguel set a bowl of broth before Rosa and watched her lift it with hands that had not yet learned to hold authority lightly. "They will read what is true," he said without sermon, merely as a fact. "If you wish to be there, you must go with your head steady." His eyes were kind in the way of someone who knows that goodness is not always rewarded, but that standing before what is yours can be necessary work. Rosa tucked the photograph of the woman with the tired smile into her apron and set her feet to the road with a careful steadiness. There was a different quality to the air now, less the metallic tang of humiliation and more the quiet weight of possible restitution. People in the market stared, some with pity, some with speculation, and a few with the small, cautious hope that the law might set right what gossip had set wrong. Licenciado Fuentes had prepared his office with the formalities of respect, a table cleared and draped with a sober cloth, chairs aligned, documents folded and bound, the ink freshly dipped in its well. He had summoned witnesses who stood with a measured patience: Dr. Ramirez, who had tended Don Rafael in his final fevered nights and could attest to dates and days; Ramon Cordero, the comisario, called less to judge than to ensure the public record was kept true; Esteban, summoned as a man whose testimony was necessary, though it would tax the pride in his chest; Lupita, with eyes hollowed by shame and remorse; and a handful of workers whose presence would complicate or confirm the house's account of itself. Valentina arrived as if the reading were merely another item to be crossed off a ledger. She entered with the white gloves, with her husband's steady posture behind her, and with a face made to show composure when the world asked for proof. Her eyes flicked to the chair at the end where Rosa might sit and narrowed like someone measuring a flaw to be corrected. The servants who had been permitted to attend stood in the doorway with their caps in hand, as if the room's gravity might pin them to the floor. Fuentes cleared his throat and began the reading with the steady cadence of a man who has made a career of turning private intentions into public fact. He opened the sheets with a reverence not for the paper itself, but for what the paper represented: the last name of a man, the settlement of his conscience, the legal skeleton of relationships once private. He read Don Rafael's words slowly so that everything in the room might be measured by them. There was an account of the house's past, a naming of debts repaid and loves deferred. Then, in a plain line that made some of the listeners lean forward, he read that Rosa Hernández, born in the hills beyond the river and placed in his care in the year 1915, was recognized as his daughter. The legal phrase was formal and bound by law: acknowledgement of lineage, presentation of evidence attached, naming of co-heiress to half the estate of Hacienda San Miguel. There was a measured gasp that sounded almost like a single animal noise, and then the quiet. Even the town's wind seemed to still itself as letters on a page did their slow work. The papers that had lain folded contained more than a name. Fuentes lifted a second bundle and unrolled a certificate written in a practiced hand. A birth record annotated, cross-checked with the midwife's note. Dr. Ramirez was called forward and confirmed he had kept records of Don Rafael's calls and that certain notations in his own books corroborated a long-ago registration. There was also a summons in the testament, objects to be delivered to Rosa, tokens of a father's concern, preserved in the notary's custody until the proper moment. Valentina's face tightened. She found the voice to object, but it trembled like a thread pulled too long. "This is extraordinary. I do not accept," she began. But Licenciado Fuentes raised a hand as if to set her agitation within the frame of what legal form allowed. "Madam," he said, "these documents were sealed and given to me per Don Rafael's instructions. They are to be read and enforced according to the law." He then opened a smaller packet and, with the same deliberate care, produced objects that had been the house's small treasures: a watch with an enamel face, a ring set in simple gold, and a folded strip of foreign coin, objects that Valentina had claimed missing in order to underwrite the accusation she had levied. The coins were there in the notary's hands, soothed by cloth and leathers, their provenance recorded in an entry Don Rafael had made months before his last breath, listing items he wished to be given to Rosa as keepsakes and as a token of his paternal recognition. The room sat in a kind of electric quiet. Lupita's fingers went cold in her lap. She had meant to hide the coins she had found in the drain and had chosen the moment to do a small, frightened kindness that turned into a betrayal. Her eyes met Rosa's in a glance that needed no words, an apology and a plea braided into one. Esteban shifted, as if his body were trying to find a new stance in the moral geography of the room. He had spoken in the heat of fear and had helped give weight to the accusation that exiled Rosa. Now, faced with paper and candor, shame made him smaller than his height should allow. He stepped forward, voice low and raw, and offered the testimony of a man who had been there long and who had seen truth and error in equal measure. "I spoke in haste," he said. "I saw coins. I did not see who placed them. I let the house's fear weigh the scale. I am sorry." That confession became a hinge. The notary recorded each word with clerical care. The commissario sat straight, recognizing that the theater of accusation had been unraveled by the sober work of records and witnesses. Valentina, stripped of the thin armor of certainty, tried different defenses. Claims about misfiled papers, suggestions that the signatures might have been forced, but each attempt withered when Fuentes produced the corroborating entries, the midwife's note, the doctor's marginalia. There was a moment when Valentina paced the room as if seeking purchase in the floorboards. "You," she breathed, "my uncle." She could not bring herself to finish the thought that would have named her greed as a sin. Her husband's hand brushed her sleeve, a gesture meant to steady, but it did little. The realization that the law could undo a carefully laid social construction left her pale in the face. Fuentes closed his ledger and looked around the room. The testament names Rosa Hernández co-heiress of half of Hacienda San Miguel, he said plainly. In addition, Don Rafael designated certain personal effects to be delivered to Señora Hernández as memorials. These have been preserved in my care. Any objections must be made according to the law, with cause shown. Absent such cause, the papers stand. The legal clarity settled over the room like a measured fog. Out in the town, a bell rang in a small church and then died away. Inside, Rosa felt an inward shift, the kind that arrives when a heavy thing is finally lifted and you do not yet know whether gravity will stay away. For Rosa, the immediate reaction was not triumph, but an almost painful bewilderment. She had carried embarrassment long enough to know the taste. Now there was an unaccustomed lightness, but also a new weight. The knowledge that she was no longer only the woman who swept, but someone with claim, someone whose voice would have to be used. Padre Miguel took her hand briefly, a small human knot of support. "You may go back," he said. "Only you know how you want to be received." It was hardly counsel, it was permission born of habit, of seeing people return to life after suffering. Rosa nodded and smoothed her apron with the same care she once gave the family's linens. Her feet felt steadier than they had in weeks. The return to Hacienda San Miguel was not cinematic. There were no trumpets and no instant acclaim. Instead, it was the slow, deliberate motion of law making its presence felt. A formal notice delivered by Fuentes, the notary's hand upon a paper that declared Rosa's rights, the commissario's presence to ensure order. Rosa walked through the gate at midday, not dressed for comfort, but for the dignity she meant to command. Her hair tied back, her gloves clean, the photograph tucked close to her heart. The courtyard's air was held taut. Workers paused from their tasks as if to bless the moment with attention. Esteban stepped forward and bowed, not as a subordinate to his mistress, but like a man acknowledging that his error had been public and that his reparation must be as well. He offered words then that some of the older hands in the fields found heavy with meaning. "I was wrong," he said, in a voice that did not try to be strong. "I spoke when I should have asked. I let doubt decide for me. I have asked Señorita Rosa for forgiveness." He bowed his head, and many of the field hands murmured a kind of assent that was not quite applause, but it was community's way of acknowledging human failings and the labor of making them right. Valentina received the news in the salon where she had first circled the room of advantage. She insisted upon meeting Rosa privately, an attempt perhaps to salvage her dignity or perhaps to ache out the truth in safer terms. And the two women faced one another in a room where the velvet curtains had once been smoothed by Rosa's hands and where the light fell like judgment through the high windows. Valentina's face carried the stains of fear and of a small, brittle pride. "You must understand," she began. "This house must be kept strong. My family—" She paused, as if the word family itself were a gift she felt entitled to guarantee. "You used fear to make sure you would not be displaced," Rosa said. Her voice was not loud. Rosa had learned the power of quiet words. "You put coins to the drain and watched a friend pick them up and used that moment to cast me out." Valentina's chin rose. "I acted to preserve the house," she said, the old justification worn thin. "Your presence, your rumor of being favored, would have split our estate. I could not allow a rumor to unravel what I believed was owed to me." "You feared what you thought you might lose," Rosa answered, "but you did not see what you were about to lose by your actions. You took a life's work in a moment." There was a long silence. Valentina's mouth softened. It was as if the legal proof had unmoored something in her chest that had been kept hard by hunger for inheritance. Tears came suddenly and without ceremony. "I loved my uncle," she said, and the words were raw. "I believed I deserved his work. I thought—" She stopped, the rest of the sentence left to hang like a shard. "I was jealous." Rosa studied her, the woman who had once been only a silhouette of consequence, and in that studying was the measure of hard choices. There was room, perhaps, for human weakness to be recognized without giving it the state of absolution. Rosa's life had not been carved by ease, and she had learned that justice does not always require vengeance. Her demand would not be for ruin, but for repair. "In front of the workers," Rosa said finally, "you will admit what you did. You will apologize publicly for the harm you caused. You will recognize my right to co-manage this estate, half by law, and you will accept terms we draw together for the fair treatment of those who live and work here. If you refuse, I will press the case in court. I do not want your ruin. I want the house made right." Valentina looked at her as if weighing two moral currencies, pride and relief. The legal exposure, now visible before the town and the notary, made the decision sharper. She dropped her chin and let the words come like a small, forced breath. I will apologize," she said. "I will tell the people, and I will accept co-management. But understand this, I am not repentant in the empty way you imagine. I was protecting what I believed was mine." "That will have to do," Rosa answered. She kept her voice steady. "And there must be conditions. Equal say, open accounts, a public apology, better rations for the workers, and a fund for medical care when illness comes. Esteban should be allowed to return with his name cleared. Lupita must be forgiven if she confesses honestly and works to repair the trust she broke. I ask that the people who have kept this house with their hands be treated with the dignity you once claimed for yourself." Valentina's face shifted. It was as if the house itself, which had been smoothed by Rosa's labor, now demanded that smoothing be acknowledged in other lives. She could not easily give up the script she had written for herself, but the law and the eyes of the town pressed with a force she had not planned for. They took their agreement to Licenciado Fuentes, who set it down in sober script. The commissary supervised, the doctor attested to the midwife's record. Esteban offered his apology in front of a thin crowd gathered in the courtyard. Valentina's public confession was formal and awkward, but it was delivered. She admitted the planting of objects, the role she had played in calling the commissary, and the social pressure she had exercised. Some in the crowd huffed, others nodded with relief. A few of the older women crossed themselves and muttered that the house's weight had chosen justice. The conditions were written with care: division of estate holdings into co-ownership, a mandate for transparent ledgers, a set of provisions for workers' welfare, a promise for improved rations, and a modest clinic fund under Dr. Ramirez's supervision, an agreement that wages would be tallied and paid with receipts, a provision for rest days when harvests allowed, and an acknowledgement that Rosa would have oversight in domestic hiring and living conditions for servants. These were not utopian reforms. They were careful, plausible changes that would make life less precarious and more fair. Rosa insisted upon a public moment that would do more than sign the papers. She wanted the apology to be heard in the courtyard, not whispered in the salon. People gathered as if a harvest had come early. Those who had looked on the night she was exiled, those who had worked for the Mendozas for years, and a few new faces who had come to see if justice could be done with human hands. Valentina stood before them, cheeks still drained by the strain, and spoke. Her voice was small but clear. "I am sorry," she said. "I acted from fear and vanity. I accused why I should have defended. I have been judged by law and will accept the consequences." For many listeners, the apology was thin medicine, but it was also medicine. Expiation in public is not always the curing of a wound, but it can be a dressing that protects against infection. Esteban stepped forward and, with his voice roughened by work and shame, asked Rosa to accept whatever forgiveness she might offer. She did, and in that acceptance there was no theatrical collapse, but a sober, principled taking up of the work ahead. The mansion's rooms did not change overnight. The servants' quarters needed repair, the drains needed mending, and the ledger where wages were recorded was a tangle that required sorting. Rosa set to work not as a conqueror, but as a manager who had the hard knowledge of service. One must show care where care had been absent, and one must insist on small dignities that matter in a life of labor. 6 months later, the changes were visible in a dozen quiet ways. The servants' beds were mended, straw had been replaced with better stuffing. The kitchen had a new set of pans that did not leak heat like old grief. Meals were still simple, but more reliable. Fresh tortillas arrived with the morning, mole came on special days, and bread that had once been thin was now sturdier. The field hands had an agreement for fair allotment of the harvest's small surplus, and a modest clinic, an outbuilding arranged with Dr. Ramirez's medicines and with a matron to keep records, sat by the side of the house where the children could be tended when fever struck. Rosa visited the fields with a sensible straw hat and a list in her apron pocket. She did not ride with the kind of swagger that announces new wealth, but with that particular dignity of someone who keeps books with the same hands that once scrubbed the floors. She listened to complaints and saw to small repairs: a ladder mended, a well cleared, a roof patched over the servants' quarters. When disputes came, who had taken too many extra loaves, whether a day's work was fully counted, she would call a meeting and say plainly what the ledger said and what justice required. People respected that she had known both the grind of labor and the weight of responsibility. Esteban married a woman from one of the neighboring houses in a small ceremony in the hacienda chapel. Rosa gave him a modest gift, a handkerchief embroidered with a pattern she had learned from the secret of her mother's sewing, and the workers came to eat and laugh like a community mending itself. Lupita stayed on, paid a small restitution in work, and was allowed to live under supervision until trust grew again. The old washerwoman who had defended Rosa from the beginning smiled each time the courtyard filled with the sound of laughter that came from people who had food and some measure of certainty. Valentina moved through the house differently. She had claimed authority once with the arrogance of someone sure of the ledger. Now she was forced to negotiate, to listen to minutes taken in the office, to see that accounts were shown and that workers had what they needed. The change was not total reform of her heart, but it was restraint. Often she would stand by a window and stare at the fields and perhaps consider the cost of guarding a name against the damage of small cruelties. There were hard days. A drought that summer could have undone their fragile improvements. A late pest plague threatened maize fields and required urgent, careful work to save the harvest. Rosa had not come into ownership with illusions. She understood scarcity and expected to manage it with temperance. She called for a council, with Esteban, Dr. Ramirez, Ramon the Comisario, and Valentina seated around a rough table, and they adjusted work, rationed seed, and tenderly negotiated small sacrifices so that the whole would survive. Those meetings were not always cordial, but they were the civic heart of the hacienda's new life. People speaking, listening, recalculating, doing the tedious business of survival together. In the salon, where once only porcelain and dust had held court, a new, modest portrait hung. A painting of Rosa seated by the kitchen smoke with the little oval photograph of the woman who had been her mother framed beside her. Don Rafael's picture remained too, not displaced but placed in a posture of recognition. The room's air had shifted. It smelled now less of discreet servitude and more of a household that knew its debts were being met. Rosa kept a small office where she received accounts and where workers could come to speak in privacy. She kept the clay mug she had always used for its memory. She did not give up the habit of making mole for the workers on festival days. It was a ritual of care and steel, and when she ladled brown sauce into bowls, the cooks watched as if learning that dignity can be practiced in the making of food. At night, when the house quieted, Rosa would sit by her window with the photograph of the woman who had been her mother. The photograph had been cleaned and placed in a new, simple frame that Father Miguel had made from an old plank. She had a small room now, modest but hers. A narrow bed held a quilt mended by hands that had learned to hold skill and tenderness equally. At the head of the bed hung the small locket Don Rafael had wished for her, the ring Fuentes had brought with the papers. Nothing flamboyant, nothing intended to announce riches to the town, but ornaments that marked a life's recognition. On a cool evening 6 months after the reading, Rosa sat by the little lamp and whispered to the photograph. "You kept me," she told the woman with the tired smile in the oval, "though I was kept by others as well. I have a name now and a work to do." She smoothed the edge of the frame with fingers that had once smoothed tablecloths. The muffled sound of voices came from the courtyard, Esteban laughing with a neighbor, a child's voice calling for more bread, and she felt, not a triumph, but a steady rightness. Valentina visited sometimes still, but more rarely than the household's rhythms required. Their relationship was not transformed into affection, but into a cautious partnership the law had sanctioned and necessity had made functional. They argued over accounts, they negotiated seed purchases, they disagreed in council, and then went their separate ways. A kind of peace settled into the house, tempered by the knowledge that human hearts are complicated and that righting a wrong does not erase years of small injuries. In time, a small schoolroom opened at the edge of the estate, funded modestly by a share of the harvest, and supervised by a teacher brought in from town. It was a quiet revolution. Children who once learned in cracked huts now had a place to sit and letters to trace with a blunt pencil. The midwife who had once attested to Rosa's birth taught the mothers a small set of health practices. Dr. Ramirez left instructions for a medicine chest kept in the clinic. These were small things, but they added up to the steady, patient work of mending what had been frayed. Rosa did not forget the night of her exile. The memory sat in her like a bruise that would not vanish. But she allowed herself an evening to stand in the doorway of the grand salon and look at the household as others might look at a garden in early spring. Things planted, things growing. The mansion belonged to her now, legally, plainly, and with all the responsibility that lineage confers. She had the keys in a small brass ring that the notary had handed her, not as a token of triumph, but as the practical means to open doors she had once dusted. Her first act with the keys had not been to enter the formerly private rooms as a conquering heiress. She had gone to a narrow, overlooked closet where supplies had been stored and found boxes of seeds and neglected tools. She ordered them inventoried and arranged for distribution among the workers who tended plots by the river. It was a small act that spoke of her priorities: food, work, care. At night, when she lay in the bed that was now hers by law and use, she would take out the photograph and a small journal where she wrote nothing ornate, but records: names of those who needed help, dates of repair, instances of kindness and cruelty. In that book, she cataloged both the practical and the tender. She did not promise herself grand gestures. She promised steady attention. Once, under a moon that misted the valley in silver, Valentina appeared at Rosa's door with a lantern in her hand. It had been a hard season of drought and negotiation. The field hands had worked late and tempers were thin. Valentina stood for a moment, and then, in a voice that had softened over months of seeing ledger and need, offered a small private apology that needed no audience. "I was wrong to push you out the night they came for you," she said. "I let fear be my counsel. I have learned a new kind of humility in a house that will not be ruled by rumor." Rosa received the words like rain on parched earth, welcome, not obliterating, but practical. "I accept your apology," she said simply. "But the house will never be safe if we allow old crouches of honor to go unexamined. We must keep the ledger honest and the accounts open." Valentina nodded, as if the anatomy of rightness could be contained in a few sensible acts. The seasons rolled their slow course. The hacienda's thin profit grew a modest sturdiness. The fields returned with planned planting. The workers' children learned to read, and the medical chest helped the sick to recover faster. The change did not make injustice vanish from the world, but it made the daily lives of those who lived and worked at San Miguel less precarious. Rosa continued to rise at dawn and warm the clay mug for herself in the hush of morning. She still scrubbed when a stubborn stain required the touch of one who understood how things are made clean. But now she set the household's accounts at midday and sat with Esteban in the evenings to plan seed and labor. Her life had the new cadence of shared authority and steady care. At the end of many long days, she would walk alone through the house, touching the frames and the doorknobs, listening to the soft sounds of life. The cow lowing at the edge of the stable, someone laughing in the kitchen, the distant thud of a mallet setting a peg. She felt the mansion as home because she had made herself attentive to it, because she had insisted that the dignity of labor be honored as much as the dignity of inheritance. On a still night, with a thin moan that made the terrace silver, Rosa sat by the small lamp and took the photograph from its frame. She could now hang it on the wall of her modest room, and it had a place there that smelled of lavender when she remembered how the paper had once smelled of it. She pressed her palms to the image for a moment and whispered, as if to a friend who had returned after a long absence, "We are here." The house was hers, not as a final claim of conquest, but as a responsibility she accepted each day. People came and went. Gossip shifted and settled. The town perceived that justice could be done without spectacle when men and women of paper and heart did the slow work together. Rosa's surprising destiny, 20 years a maid and then named co-heiress, had not made her into something other than herself. It had allowed her to take a place that had always been partly hers by the work she'd done and by the bond that an old man had tried to honor when he could no longer speak it. In the quiet that followed, she folded the photograph back into its frame and set it on the small table beside her bed. She did not sleep with the lights on. She did not require applause. She closed her eyes with the soft certainty of one who had been seen at last and who had chosen to meet being seen with a steadiness that would care for the people around her. If this story moved you, like and share. Tell us, would you have forgiven Valentina? And when the house settled, when the lamps were guttering and the quiet came with the night, Rosa rested. The mansion she had polished for 2 decades belonged to her now, by name, by law, and by the slow courage of the choices she made each morning at dawn.